you want to hit the record button? I can see it's recording. Lovely, thank you so much. Okay, so welcome to everybody who's here for our first social work webinar of 2021. My name's Michaela Rogers. I'm a senior lecturer in the social work team in the Department of Sociological Studies. So it's great to see so many of you here, and people are still joining. Before I pass you on to our excellent speakers who are going to kick us off for our webinar series, I just would like to remind everybody to make sure that your microphones and your cameras are switched off through the presentation. At the end, we will have a little bit of time for questions, so then you can switch your mic on or use the chat box function to ask questions if you like, and I'll moderate that. I'll keep my eye on what's happening in the chat box. So for those of you who are new to Blackboard Collaborate, I'll just explain where the chat box is. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a little purple tab. If you click on that, and then you should see a little speech bubble. If you click on the speech bubble, you will open up the chat box. So feel free to use that. We are recording this session, but I'm going to just record the presentation, and we'll stop recording before the Q&A, just because if there are any questions that you wish to ask, we can't get everybody's consent to be recorded because there are just too many of you, which is brilliant. So we'll just record the presentation. Okay, I don't think there's anything else to say other than that. Thanks for coming. I hope you enjoy this next hour, and it's great to see you, and please do look out for further sessions that we're going to be running throughout the year. Okay, so Sue, I'll hand over to you, and I'll switch my mic off if that's okay.
Okay. Hello, I hope people can hear me. Michaela will nod probably if or something. Hi everyone. It's very peculiar speaking to you when I can't see you. However, I will try and animate myself. I'm Sue White. I'm Professor Emerita of Social Work at the University of Sheffield. And with Matthew and Dave today, we're going to talk about some of the main ideas in the book that you can see there, which was also written by Trish Walsh, who has recently retired from University College Dublin. We started this project really sort of taking over from a project that Trish had started and became unwell and needed collaborators. So it kind of emerged really from somewhat eclectic roots. And I've always had an interest, a sort of critical interest in attachment theory because it is so dominant in child welfare practice and used in a sort of diagnostic manner. So I've always had a degree of skepticism about whether this was necessarily a good thing, because it is a very malleable theory, so much so that there is very little in human behaviour that it couldn't plausibly explain, from shoplifting to car theft to mental illness or whatever. And that's always feels quite dangerous to me when a theory is as flexible as that. So I started off from this kind of critical position, very sceptical about it. And in reviewing the origins and early work from John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth and others, I started to feel somewhat different about it, and to see it as possibly a way of celebrating love and relational bonds. But this requires us to use it in a very different way to the way it has been used dominantly in child welfare practice. So I'll just give you a brief introduction to what, right, here we go. Just put my glasses on for this bit. So this is just about the purpose of the book. And we're saying here that it's not a comprehensive critical review of the literature. There are many people who've written in great detail particularly Robert Dushinsky from the social science side, about attachment theory, its origins, and so on. So this is really our attempt to make a correction to the current settlement in practice. Our analysis is a warning about misapplications of attachment theory, but we also want to go a little further and say that some of our professional and lay explanatory models have become a little bit too attached to attachment theory, and in other ways not attached enough. So we will show that the reading of attachment theory dominant in practice promotes what I've just mentioned, a problematic diagnostic mindset in practitioners, and doesn't pay sufficient attention to the impact of our systems on the conditions for ensuring and valuing enduring relationships for children and indeed adults. In fact, quite a lot of professional practice is very good at severing those. So we're celebrating attachment theory, we're using it with enthusiasm, but we're not paying attention to some of its most fundamental tenets. Okay, so love is a wondrous state. This is a quote from Harry Harlow, who did some of the animal work on what has become known as attachment, using surrogate mothers for rhesus monkeys. So he would make wire mothers, and some of them would be cuddly and soft, and some of them wouldn't. And this was his attempt in part to challenge a notion at the time, which from behaviorism, that somehow infants became attached to their mothers because their mothers fed them. A simple stimulus response, kind of Pavlovian idea about why attachment bonds would form. And he was very enchanted with this idea of love, which is something really fundamental in attachment theory's origins. So we've got Harry Harlow doing work on monkeys in the States, and we've also got some empirical observations by James Robertson, who was a social worker, about children's distressed reactions when their parents left them in hospital where visiting was prohibited. So two kind of different sorts of empirical work there. One's observation, kind of anthropological, what is going on here and why might this happen? What are these phases of distress that children go through? So we start from a concern about children's separation from parents. And if we think about the way in which attachment theory is often used in the child protection system, it's often used as a justification for severing children's relationships with their parents. So this is a bit of a paradox. So attachment theory itself is quite a complicated, multifaceted phenomenon, and it's a synthesis of kind of psychoanalytic work, object relations theory, which is looking at the relation between the infant and the primary object, usually the mother. But this is married with ethological developmental psychology, which is informed from animal studies. How do animals parent? And so what we get is a suggestion of a kind of symbiotic dance of nature and nurture, with a very controversial emphasis on the mother-infant dyad, arguably, well, strongly, at the expense of understanding the influence of other caregivers, other relationships, including siblings. So it shares with object relations theory an emphasis on the infant's relationship with the primary object, but these ideas are combined with cognitive psychology, interesting cybernetics. So think about a room thermostat. So an idea that somehow these systems are homeostatic, that the infant influences the mother influences the infant until they get into some kind of symbiotic state. And as I say, also based on ethology and evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology. Animal models were important from the start, particularly Harry Harlow with his surrogate mothers, and Konrad Lorenz work on imprinting in geese. So what we have is a theory that's an elegant theory, but really it's a bit of a pragmatic mishmash, rising from attempts to make sense of these empirical observations of distressed children, but then kind of morphing into an aspiration to make the world a better place for everyone by understanding the medium of love. So there's a kind of almost a sort of utopian element to it, which I think has got great potential, which we'll come back to in the end, at the end of the presentation. So it's very important to note that there is this biological component to attachment theory, and I think that there's some evidence that Bowlby quite deliberately drew on the work animal models in order to add a bit of scientific heft to the theory. And this is Bowlby talking about the mother-infant relationship, and this is not the kind of way in which social workers generally think about attachment theory. It's not really known that commonly that there is this this kind of systems aspect to it. So it says, in human infants, the crying response is probably so designed that it is terminated not only by food, but also by other stimuli connected with the mother's presence. Initially, probably kinesthetic or tactile. As an example, but no proof of this, we may refer to the common experience that babies often cry when they are not hungry, and that this crying may be quietened by touch or rocking, and later by voice. The mother thus provides the terminating or consummatory stimuli for crying, stimuli which may rather aptly be described as social suppressors. So you can see that this is, we could be talking about an animal here. It's the same kind of thing. He was concerned about the kind of following behaviour that you saw in geese. Well, obviously, human infants can't follow, so they have to do something else, is the argument, and crying, eliciting care from the caregiver is one of those things that they might do. And it's striking how animal models, how influential animal models were. This is Bowlby again, and I'll tell you what this animal is at the end. Thus, once again, it is found that a change occurring within an animal, in all likelihood a change in hormonal level, leads to changes in her behaviour, e.g. care of young, that result in her receiving stimulation from the environment, which itself has an effect on her hormonal level. It's talking about a mother here. And that again influences her behaviour and perhaps her sensitivity. And so the kind of stimulation that she receives, the more adequately any sequence of instinctive behaviour is analysed, the more certain are interactive cycles of this kind to be found. Since they occur in lower mammals, it must be expected that in due course they will be identified in higher mammals, primates, and in man himself. Well, the creature that is being discussed there is the rat. So we can see that there is this idea that this is a fundamental mammalian process that is going on here. Slide. Right. But there are always, throughout, moral dimensions, which you would expect. Once you start looking at parenting behaviours, you start to get other utopian fantasies of trying to optimise the normal. And in optimising the normal, you get categories of pathology. So this is an early quote from Mary Ainsworth from 1965, sorry, which is quite florid in its metaphors. The proper care of children deprived of a normal home life can now be seen to be not merely an act of common humanity, but to be essential for the mental and social welfare of a community. For if their care is neglected, they grow up to reproduce themselves. Deprived children, whether in their own home or out of them, are the source of social infection as real and serious as are carriers of diphtheria and typhoid. Now, it's easy to see that as some kind of artifact from the Dark Ages, but we're still using this. We now call it toxic stress and a whole range of other things to refer to damage that is done to children by not parenting that is considered to be not good enough. So I think this is the final one of mine before I hand over to Matthew. Attachment theory has been curiously resistant to criticism from many sources. Margot Vasido discusses this in her work and points to a number of things that have created this resilience. So she argues that to achieve consistency with neighbouring disciplines, Bowlby had to ignore quite a few controversies and debates from within psychology, from within psychoanalysis, from within ethology and animal studies and biology. And there were heated debates, as they still are, about the place of instincts, the role of the so-called unconscious, and the importance of sensitive periods in child development. He would also edit out some findings from animal studies. For example, Harry Harlow's work showed very clearly that in these infant monkeys who were reared without a living mother, they were reared by these food-giving wire mothers, and they became quite disturbed. But actually, when they were in the presence of peers, their development was okay, actually. So why do we not have any work on the importance of siblings, for example? Very little. So the selectivity and pragmatism, whilst because it insulated it from criticism, it allowed the theories the flexibility to be used in clinical practice and to do some good things, very good things, like challenging damaging practices like separation of children from parents during hospitalisation. The experimental component, which Matthew is going to talk about in a minute, the strange situation procedure, was designed for research purposes, but would morph into a diagnostic mindset focused on classifying different kinds of attachment and inferring from this the possibility of future harm. So we thus move from an observation and a theoretical concept of a kind of hydraulic love brought forth, and that changes to a diagnostic gaze on love gone wrong. And I think we're arguing really that social work's got rather stuck on the diagnostic role of diagnostic gaze of love gone wrong. Right, yeah, so over to Matthew now.
Okay. So it's useful to look at the development of the theory to understand the way that we use it and which parts of the theory we're currently using. So Bowlby, I'm making an assumption here that you know something about attachment theory because it's so widely taught and used in practice and on social work education programs, etc. So you probably know the story of Bowlby, who grew up in a upper middle class English family and spent very little time with his mother. I think it was something like half an hour a day at the end of the day, and spent most of his time with the nanny. And then when that nanny moved on, he was devastated, and he spent a large part of his early life wondering why he was so devastated that his nanny had disappeared. And then he was sent to boarding school, and he described going to boarding school as something that you wouldn't even do to a dog, let alone a child. And so he had these things about loss and traumatic experiences before he entered into his professional life as a psychiatrist and trained as a psychoanalyst. So he was very much interested in these things. So that was sort of a motivating factor for him. And he was very much influenced, as Sue was saying, about from a social worker who was working in hospitals and was looking at this loss and trauma of children and their parents. So Bowlby's theory was very much about loss and early separations, and that was what he was talking about, and that's what his books were. That's what the theory was based on. It was then Mary Ainsworth who took on Bowlby's ideas, was very taken by them, and she wanted to expand them into a bigger theory, because she started to apply the ideas that Bowlby had, which were higher level concepts, as Sue was saying, but there was not really any work done from Bowlby's perspective in terms of turning them into a way of measuring, as you know, psychology and other sort of hard sciences like to do. So Ainsworth's idea was to sort of like turn those concepts into something that you could actually measure, which is where the idea of the strange situation came from. What she wanted to understand was that she had already done a PhD before coming to Bowlby's work on security theory. So she'd brought security theory with her, then applied it to Bowlby's idea of attachment, and merged the two together. Now, we don't really see those as separate anymore. If you talk about attachment theory, we talk about secure and insecure attachment. But Bowlby didn't talk about secure and insecure attachment. It was Ainsworth that was introducing a different theory and merging those together. So it's this continual sort of development of a theory by merging other things together based on what people perceive to be of interest to them. And by bringing those in, what Ainsworth could argue is to say, well, people can be securely attached or insecurely attached, bringing the concepts from security theory. So it moved from being this theory about loss and separation, and she applied these ideas. She started in Uganda, as you probably know, and then started to work with white middle class families in America, and could start to say, well, there is a way of describing child development which applies to all children and all families, irrespective, because it's biological, irrespective of their culture or their ethnicity or their class or whatever. We can just apply this because it's a biological process. And because we have like secure attachment, the very word is like, this is good, we should be really thinking about how to make people feel securely attached, whatever that might mean. We can say that that's the good thing, and the insecure attachment is the bad thing, so atypical. So we had this sort of development of the strange situation procedure, which you probably are familiar with. So you have a room where typically the mother and the child are in the room, and then the mother is asked to leave the room for 3 minutes and then come back in, and they observe what the child does while the mother leaves, while she's gone, and when she returns. And those are sort of looking at the core concepts that Ainsworth had taken from Bowlby's work about loss and separation. So what happens when the mother leaves? Is there a sense of wanting to express their emotions or suppress them, or do them in what should be the right way, which is express them to a certain degree, and then when the mother comes back in, can be comforted fairly quickly and easily, and then carry on with whatever they're doing. So she was trying to codify all of that. There was significant criticism at the time. Bowlby was criticized, and he was excluded. Well, he excluded himself from the Psychoanalytical Association because every time he went to the conferences, he felt harangued. So he just stopped going because it was a real challenge to the status quo at the time of Sigmund Freud's ideas of psychoanalysis, drive theory, sexual drives, and Bowlby didn't believe that really gave him a way of understanding his experience or those that he was looking into. But you also had sort of anthropologists like Margaret Mead saying, this is just not the way that families operate around the world. You don't get mothers and their children living almost in a bubble. You get families and wider family members and groups and networks and communities all working together, and that's the norm. and there isn't sort of the primary caregiver necessarily in lots of cultures as there is in the sort of core theory of attachment theory. So once you sort of like conceptualize family as a mother and a child, and then a few people around them, like perhaps a father, then you sort of are tied to that way of seeing families, which is not what everybody believed. The idea at the time, you know, as well, you know, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, as this theory was developing, you had very much mothers were placed right at the center, because that was the where, you know, culturally at the time in America, UK, places that was how we perceived childcare. Mothers were looking after their children. So if you didn't have a secure child, a securely attached child, it was seen as atypical, and it was then seen as the mother's problem, because the mother was looking after the child. And I guess there is a question, and I'll sort of come on to looking at things in practice in just a moment, whether we still carry that with us. But the other point to make about the criticisms was very much that Bowlby, Ainsworth and others that started to follow attachment theory and start to develop it had to develop a sort of an advocacy component to it. They had to start to develop ways in which they were advertising and promoting this theory to others in the scientific community and other communities that they were trying to engage, because they were at risk of being completely sidelined and not taken seriously, and they believed in this theory, so they spent an awful lot of time promoting it, and that sometimes led to simplifications of the theory in an attempt to try and get people to believe it. Sorry, the buttons. So the next sort of move, and this is where it starts to get a bit complicated really, because we've Ainsworth had two PhD students, Mary Main and Patricia Crittenden. Mary Main was 10 years, I did a PhD with Mary Ainsworth 10 years before Crittenden. But what's important is that these two people created two different strands of attachment theory, and that still remains to this very day. So when we are talking about attachment theory, and when we write in our reports or we read in books, etc., about attachment theory, we should really be asking which form of attachment theory are we reading about. But it very, very rarely ever says anything about it. Crittenden does, but Mary Mains doesn't, because Mary Mains assumes to be the sort of dominant force, in part because it is much simpler. And that's problematic, which is very much sort of what Sue was talking about at the beginning, which is about how we diagnose or categorize certain children as being certain forms of attachment relationships. And they differ, and how they differ is very interesting in terms of what it really says about the theory. So Mary Main was saying that attachment behaviors, so that's crying and smiling and cooing and anything that sort of brings the parent towards the child, proximity, that is what the child is organizing their behaviors around, anything to get the primary caregiver to come close to them. So you can cry and then you can come close to them. You can continue to cry, and that's then still keeping them close. You can perhaps not cry if coming to them is if they're close by, even though they might feel like they want to cry. The whole entire point of her thing is about the way that behaviors are organized to get them to come close, whereas Crittenden was saying, actually, it's not about proximity, it's about availability, which is different, because availability is about getting them to come close and be attentive to them, not just to be close to them. And so there was this big debate between them, and I say debate, it was a very fractious and quite vicious at times argument about what attachment actually means. Are we talking about behaviors that are organized to get people to come close to them, or are we talking about behaviors that are organized to get people to come and be sensitive to them? And those two things are different, and might seem fairly trivial to, you know, most people sort of looking at that and trying to think, well, how are they different? But actually sort of like saying, if we can't really know what attachment is, how can we be diagnosing or categorizing or using it as a way to sort of say, well, this is a really important way of understanding families. So Crittenden has a different way of categorizing children to Main. I think on the next slide, yeah, so this is Mary Main's theory. And it's Mary Main's, it's become the dominant theory because of its simplification. So you say there is a secure child, someone who has a secure attachment, which means that their behaviors are organized in a way which gets their primary caregiver to come and be close to them, and that they can be comforted and soothed fairly easily because the primary caregiver is sensitive and nurturing and responsive. But if the theory goes, if you are not sensitive, nurturing, responsive, etc., the child develops strategies to in response to that. So you can become insecure, and one of those is to be avoidant, so you don't express those feelings that you might have. You don't necessarily get upset, you keep it in, and that means that the caregiver can stay close to you even though you might be feeling upset, because if you do get upset, they might not respond in a way that you want them to. They might walk away, might leave you on your own, or whatever. Resistant behaviors are those which sort of like continue to be upset, so it keeps them close. But it's insecure because they continue with their distress. But in their observations, she was sort of saying, well, actually, there's loads of children that don't actually fit either of these ABC type, as they're referred to in attachment theory, and they classified them as disorganized. And then there was this big debate because Patricia Crittenden saying there's no such thing as disorganized really, because it's still organized, because even though they might be behaving in sort of bizarre ways, actually it means the caregiver comes to them and tries to give them what they need, and that can be, anyway, the details aren't really important. The point is that because we can't understand really what attachment was, these two different strands of attachment theory become very distant, and different researchers and different writings attach themselves to different people. But what we understand it to be, mostly in the handbooks and in the things that you read or on our courses, is that really everybody should be B. B is good, A and C are bad, D is really bad, and actually probably because of poor or abusive parenting. And that's sort of the proxies that we get. And we use these ideas or you see these ideas in practice. So this is from a book on attachment theory by David Shemmings and Yvonne Shemmings. So it says, a crucial turning point in the development of attachment theory was the hugely influential and timely collaboration between John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth in the late 60s, during which period they developed the classic and elegant experiment known as the strange situation. This is so cool because the procedure mildly activates a toddler's attachment system, where a stranger enters a room in which he or she is playing with toys accompanied by the child's primary carer. The strange situation procedure provides information about the child's trust in the physical and emotional availability and responsiveness of his or her primary caregiver. So that's the sort of thing that you get in the books, and then we then, in our profession in social work, take that on. What that does, though, is it sort of doesn't tell you very much at all about the whole entire world in which that was created. So what is the strange situation procedure? Why was it developed in the first place? And why were they trying to categorize and measure these behaviors? You know, what were the responses, what were the assumptions underneath the strange situation procedure about families and about the way that families operated, and about what children were experiencing and what it meant for them to cry or not cry, or to act in certain ways that made no sense to the people who were actually observing them? Why were these names chosen in the first place? You know, all of this is just sort of excluded from the way that we are sort of taught, which tells us quite a lot about the theory that we're using in the first place, and whether we should be using these names. You know, do we really want to be using a concept which, for many people in the attachment theory world, is about a biological process, which there are lots of people that don't accept this is a biological process that is a part of all human beings. You know, there are lots of people who would argue that this is cultural phenomenon rather than it necessarily being a biological one. But because the idea of black boxing is that it gets put in a black box that we don't get to see, that we no longer have access to, we just get presented with what's the face value of it, which is here is a theory which has scientific backing underneath it, and you can use it so that it can help you out in making your assessments and recommendations to child protection conferences or courts or whatever. We don't get to see what's inside the black box which created the theory in the first place. And what that does is it creates an idea that attachment is a scientific fact. And so there was an awful lot of advocacy going on, which was, you know, we have this science, we have these findings, and people should be parenting according to these certain principles, because that's what the science tells you should be doing. And because then people parent in that particular way, it sort of legitimizes the science. And then once people are parenting in that sort of way, based on a sort of scientific basis, you then will have anybody who's involved in, you know, helping people parent, like social workers and other professionals. That sort of becomes the foundation as a scientific sort of basis for helping or assessing or working with parents. And then once you've got attachment as the scientific fact, or it's established as a fact, and you've got a whole entire professional background or basis for using attachment to support parenting or understand parenting, it forms a very strong case for developing policies based on attachment. So you can see there's an interaction between all of these things: attachment as a scientific basis, attachment as the foundation for parenting, attachment as the foundation for professional practice, and attachment as the foundation for policy. And they all interact with each other to support each other and continue the process. And we can see that quite clearly, and this was the Department of Health guidance at the time. It said, secure attachments are so important in the early years. Where these attachments are absent or broken, decisions to provide children with new attachment figures must be taken as quickly as possible to avoid developmental damage. Careful distinction has to be drawn between delay, which is harmful to a child's development, and taking appropriate time to make good plans. Everything about this statement is wrong. So secure attachments are so important in the early years. Well, they are and they aren't, in that those who are actually categorized as insecure aren't any worse off in many ways than those with secure attachment. So the research will show that, you know, 50% of the population will come out as securely attached. Putting to one side whether we actually accept secure attachments as a concept, or, you know, the way that it's graded. But lots of people with insecure attachments are perfectly fine. Insecure attachment in and of itself is not a bad thing. Attachments aren't absent unless you lived in an orphanage where there is no primary caregiver to provide you with any care. So the fact that, you know, there's probably so few children who have no attachment in the UK, and this is sort of in this sort of guidance. And attachments aren't broken. You know, I could go on about like this statement. There's pretty much everything about it is just not accurate according to the theory, and it just gives the impression that unless you're securely attached, you probably should be removed because it's really bad for you, and you should make that decision fairly quickly. Now, that might not be the intention that was behind this particular piece of guidance, but it's essentially what it says. And that continues the promotion of attachment theory as the foundation for professional practice and decision making about the most important decisions about whether children should be placed with their families or not. And, you know, attachment theory is, the attachment researchers are very clear that it is one component of child development. It isn't all child development. You know, there's so much additional components that we should consider, that this is about loss and what happens with the separation. You know, what happens when the child is separated and how do they feel when that person is separated when they're separated from the primary caregiver, and what's their response like when they come back. So there's nothing about how they're done about play or discipline or any other things which are components of being a parent. But it's become so ingrained in practice that we can sort of, this is a quote that I'll read out in just a moment, taken from research that I did where I followed social workers around for 6 months, and I looked, you know, what they did and what their interactions and the conversations in the office, and read their reports. And so this is taken from one of their reports, and there were lots of examples where they used things like strong attachment or weak attachment, which again, you know, should never really be used because those just aren't terms. They make no sense from a theoretical perspective. But actually, it's how it becomes then much more ingrained in practice and how people talk about it without really talking about, without using the attachment theory language. You can actually still continue to talk about it in an indirect way. And that's what this sort of, taken from a Child Protection Conference report, illustrates. It says, it is apparent that the mother's parenting is causing the child physical and emotional harm. The child is suffering from episodic punitive parenting and living in an environment that features high criticism and low warmth. The child receives inconsistent care and must be in a state of high arousal, never knowing whether his mother is going to be kind or cruel. I am skeptical that the child has ADHD, and I suspect assessments will determine that there is nothing wrong with him. The issues are linked to the parenting and care he is afforded. These life experiences are likely to be harmful to the child in the longer term, and not only now, as he will not learn how to interact with others appropriately and will struggle to form healthy relationships. It is apparent that the child is developing coping mechanisms to deal with his mother and has learned not to react to her excessive shouting. The mother does not have the insight to see this as resilience. I suspect she will view it as defiance. So some of the core concepts of attachment theory are seen within this, which is that there's the primary caregiver as the mother, and the mother is responsible for the child's development of their emotional, physical development. And while there might be some aspect of truth to some of this, having an insecure attachment or displaying difficult, challenging behavior doesn't necessarily link to whether the parent has been responsive and nurturing and sensitive, because there are times when that happens and the child does still end up with a so-called insecure or even disorganized attachment. So that link isn't, there is a weak to moderate association to those things. So it's not a strong, we're not talking in the evidence as a strong correlation between what a mother does and what ends up happening within that particular child. But you can see underneath this is a very clear link. The mother does this, and this is what happens to the child, and the mother can't see it, so it's sort of her fault. So we can sort of see underneath this that there is sort of some theoretical underpinnings, and that's very much what happened when I sort of spoke to them about what they were writing and how they were understanding it. It was very much about attachment theory without using the language of attachment theory, but sort of in a way which divorces the child from the parents, because they see the parents as somehow harming the child and therefore they shouldn't be with them. Which sort of takes us onto disorganized attachment. Now, did you want to, am I bringing you in here, Sue, or am I saying something about disorganized attachment? Sorry, I'm...
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. I just very quickly want to talk about the category disorganised that Matthew has said has become associated with, it's become to be seen as synonymous with abuse, basically. And sorry, this paper, you will be able to access these slides, I'm sure, but this paper is open access, so you can download and read this paper that Matthew, Dave and myself have written, which talks in detail about the disorganised attachment arguments. So the highlights from this paper is that disorganised attachment has been influential in child protection practice and seen as a sign of abusive parenting. But as Matthew said, there's considerable controversy about its origins and a lot of debate in the scientific community about the transmission mechanism and indeed whether it's a category at all. So the category should be handled with care in the child protection system, but there's considerable evidence that it isn't. So here's a couple of quotes from the family courts. Dr. Williams, who's a psychologist, I recall, Dr. Williams' greatest concern from a developmental perspective was that the consequences of the child being raised within a chaotic and disorganised attachment relationship would have a severe and detrimental impact on the child's outcome as a young man. So you can see there this casting forth into the future that this disorganised attachment relationship is going to have dire consequences in the future. It's a kind of precautionary principle that this is a bad thing, and we have more black boxing about disorganised attachment. I won't read both of these, but well, I will actually. The first one is from decision making in the child's time scale, which is still being used to inform decisions in the child protection system, somewhat scandalously in my view. There is consistent evidence that up to 80% of children brought up in neglectful or abusive environments develop disorganised attachments. Well, that's completely in a black box. What is up to 80%? Is it 79%? Is it 0.5%? Doesn't mean anything. And again, from David and Yvonne Shennings, disorganised attachment behaviour is indicative as distinct from predictive, because its presence does not imply a child will be or is even likely to be maltreated in the future. Instead, it suggests that they may well have been abused already and are still experiencing the consequences of maltreatment, shown by the way they react and respond to mild activation of their attachment system. Very, very similar kind of perspective to the one that Matthew pointed out before, and completely opaque. It doesn't tell us how contested this category is. So in 2007, a list of some up to 40, I think it was, authors from the great and good of the attachment community wrote a consensus statement. And in fact, Matthew sent me a paper this morning called Attachment Goes to Court, which is just come out and is a further attempt to correct the overzealous use of attachment theory in the court system. So the consensus statement from the lead researchers in attachment says that disorganised infant behaviour is not sufficient for a disorganised classification. It's not a fixed property anyway. It's relationship specific. It doesn't necessarily mean that the child has behaviour problems. Using something that's designed in a research environment doesn't mean that you're going to be able to find these behaviours in the home, and it should not be used as a diagnostic tool. So they say very clearly, it has insufficient sensitivity and specificity for screening for maltreatment. Even when accredited reliability is in place, that is where somebody is coding this behaviour who is expert in spotting it in a research environment. The results should be used to inform clinical formulation rather than as a definitive means of assessment for maltreatment or developmental risk. So that's very clear. It should not be used as a category to inform decision making in the courts. And they suggest that these misapplications may selectively harm already underprivileged families, violate children's and parents' human rights, and represent discriminatory practice against minorities. It's a very strong statement, this, and yet disorganised attachment, as Matthew has indicated, as we can see in the family courts, is used routinely in child protection practice. Right, I'm going to hand you over to Dave now for the complicated bit. because when we were digging around in the literature referred to in the consensus statement, we came across some interesting things, and I think it's illustrative to look at them, because we can see that when people design experiments, even well-conducted experiments, often have a normative dimension. They have a kind of moral case that they're trying to present. So I'm gonna hand it. We've gone down to one computer because our system was failing to cope. So I'm just going to change seats now and hand you over to Dave.
All right, folks. Oops. I'm just trying to put myself onto a rather wobbly office chair at the moment. I perhaps just should begin. This is only going to be a cameo. I'm looking at Matthew to make sure that he can hear me clearly enough. Yes, he's grinning, so he obviously can, so that's good. Just to explain my presence here, because I feel a little bit of an interloper. My background is not in social work at all. I'm a professor of information systems, emeritus professor at Nottingham University Business School. I got a couple of grandkids, of course, and a couple of kids of my own. So I think, as a layperson, I think I've got an ethnographically informed view of the subject, but I wouldn't make any more claim to authority than that. Okay, so I'll stop rambling because we're kind of running out of time. One of the things, well, okay, I kind of got into the modeling business, which is what I'm talking about here. Through 10 years in the medical school at Manchester, and looking at, as a medical statistician was part of my role. And although we have got misgivings about attachment theory in terms of its consequences for policy and practice, it does not compare with another model which has become somewhat notorious over the last 12 months. Which was the Imperial College model of looking at the COVID epidemic and the effect of various interventions on that. I did a lot of work in my early days with a virologist, a guy called Maurice Longson, and I've been pretty appalled at a lot of people have commented on the shoddiness of this work, and it has been pretty crap, to put it delicately. And all I can say here is, you know, if you look at the kinds of things on this slide, it's really just to illustrate the crudeness of this model, and given the consequences it's had for the people of this country, it's quite extraordinary. You know, if you look at things like what's going to be the impact of closing schools, well, closing schools, 25% of universities remaining open, all sorts of arbitrary figures just plucked out of the air, feeding into a model which, as I said, has had absolutely profound consequences. I think, so that finishes that atrocity story. So I think at a completely different end of the spectrum are my concerns really about, hang on a sec, I'm struggling. Okay, next slide. We've got various mice here. Have I got the right mouse, Sue? Right, we've got two computers on the desk and I've been pressing the wrong button. Okay, let's get on to my little cameo piece. We tried to dig into some of the primary science that gave rise to what we've been referring to as the black box. And so we picked out a couple of seminal pieces of work. And I looked in detail at a study by attachment disorganization, and it was it had 1,250 sites, so I think we can conclude it's a pretty authoritative piece of work. But we wanted to have a little bit of a look at it, really, look into under the bonnet, look into the black box. And I think it illustrates a number of points in detail that we've been trying to make, which have been themes of this presentation. So it's trying to look at the long term. It's a very powerful piece of work methodologically. A lot of kids were followed up over a significant piece of time. A lot of things were measured in terms of their school performance and adjustment later on in life. I took a particular look at psychopathology and the relationship between that and attachment disorganization. Obviously when first 12 months of life. And the point about this was there's two models here. The model at the top, A, is that it shows the relationship between early caregiving and subsequent psychopathology. And you can see attachment disorientation, disorganization in there. And the argument from this diagram is there's a 0.25 correlation. Yes, I agree with that comment. Sorry, I'm being distracted by the things that are popping up. My point here is there's a particular, when we make models, whether it's the Imperial College model or the models in research on attachment theory, what we're doing is, really, this is an articulation generally of a worldview. We configure the world in a particular way. We're interested in the phenomenon. We build a model, by which I mean to say an abstraction, something that gets at the Platonic essence of things, and then we try to study that simple representation of the world in order to advance our understanding of the problem at hand. And so here, it's a simple kind of model. And it says, yes, there's a relationship, the little numbers on the arrows are causal relationships. 0.25 says between attachment disorganization and psychopathology says there's a small correlation between attachment disorganization in early childhood and psychopathology later on in adolescence. And early caregiving, this is an attempt to measure how effective parents are in the study, and it says there's a larger relationship between that and attachment. So if you read that figure, it says early caregiving strongly negatively influences attachment disorganization. In other words, the less good you are as a parent, the more likely your child is to exhibit attachment disorganization. And subsequently, the positive correlation says, many years later, this could manifest itself in psychopathology during adolescence. I think that's basically how you'd read that. The point we're trying to make in the paper, which is about where does this model come from? And we're trying to argue this is an arbitrary way of structuring the world. It reflects an ideological primacy given to the parent. So the parent is the primary causal influence over the behavior of the child, and that has subsequent effects in adolescence. Okay, so that's one way of construing things. But Carlson provided us with her correlation matrix, which meant that we could do another bit of modeling using the same data, and just to change the causal primacy around. So let's look at things in a different way. What happens if actually it's the intrinsic characteristics of the child, its endogenous characteristics? I mean, we all know we've got kids. Some kids are more difficult to parent than others. Maybe that's what's influencing things. So the primary thing might be for things that are endogenous to the child. So we can build another model, and that says, well, that shows significant relationships. It says it's exactly the same data, but we're using it to make a completely different narrative. Okay, that's the point. But it's the attachment disorganization, or in other words, the degree of disorganized behavior on the child, which is influencing the parental behavior, and that ultimately is what is leading to the psychological consequences later. Well, we're not trying to say that one model is right and another model is wrong. We're just trying to say that the type of model that you set up and that you test reflects your ideology, your presuppositions and belief systems about the world. That, I guess, is the point that we're trying to make. There was a subsequent point that I was going to argue. I'm just looking at Sue because we're concerned about time pressures, but I think that was really what we were trying to say here. That what you decide, the way in which you build your models, okay, and when you're doing research, that these models do not arrive objectively from somewhere. They often reflect, and typically do reflect, the hypotheses that you've set up, which reflect your moral and your general ideological position on the phenomenon that you're interested in. So I think, but oh yeah, one last thing. We did adduce a little bit of actual evidence that suggests that there are genetic factors, which, if you look at those, then which can give indications of ADHD in children, and there is some research that links that in to support this kind of model. But I guess what we're trying to do in this paper as a whole, in this presentation as a whole, is decoct, boil down a really, really complicated argument that we've elaborated over several chapters and try to sort of distill out the essence for you. So I kind of hope that I've made my points reasonably effectively, and Sue is kind of nodding at me in an ambiguous way. I think she's probably get off the pot, I think is what she's saying. So I'm going to get off the pot and hand over to Sue.
Right. Hello, everyone. I think that the point's been well made there, that when science is not something that takes place in some kind of moral vacuum, the way in which people establish the experiments, and Matthew talked about the strange situation procedure, and what were they trying to do, and what assumptions were there in there from the start. Now, we've had a hint there that actually, I mean, you know, those of us who are parents know that children are different. Some children are easier to parent than others. And that's a bit of a contentious thing to say in the child welfare system. Because if children are difficult to parent, we look for the problems in the child. We look to the parents to explain what those problems in the child might be. But actually, attachment theory, right from the start, has said, oh, no, this isn't either one person or another. This isn't one entity or the other. This is a complex symbiotic relationship. The characteristics of the infant will influence parenting behaviour. So that's the basic message. And when we look at the design of experiments, we can see the presupposition that it's the parenting that's the problem. Now, it might be, but it isn't necessarily. So just a couple of concluding comments. What's coming over the hill is more biology. So people are now doing work in attachment, which is going under the skin and trying to find the damage, not to explain different kinds of infant behaviour, not looking for the causes of ADHD or whatever, but looking to see whether they can find little bits of broken biology inside the bodies of children who are deemed to have problematic attachments. And this is just give you a flavour of that. Attachment security may buffer against the heightened inflammatory consequences associated with low socioeconomic status. Conversely, insecurely attached individuals who are also facing chronic or acute stressors may have greater inflammatory responses than securely attached individuals who are experiencing similar levels of stress. Quite extraordinary when we go back to what Matthew said at the beginning, which is 50%, at least 50% of the population is insecurely attached. So there's a whole pile of inflammation going on out there, folks. And this seems to us to be the wrong thing to look at. So we need to go from diagnostics to ethics. What would need to change for the research, policy and practice agendas to shift from fixing people before they're broken or providing evidence for social and biological engineering? What would need to change if the child welfare system were to follow the emphasis on love and affectionate bonds, which, as Jasinski et al. Argue, could be liberating and radical? Well, a great deal would need to change. So I think this is the final slide, if I can get it to appear. Yeah, there we go. So how do we have ethical attachment-minded practice? Well, we have to understand the theory and its development. We've been trying to argue that. It can be helpful as a sensitizing concept. It's got a kind of trivial but rather wonderful truth about it, about those affectionate bonds. We shouldn't be using the categories because they are artifacts from a research process. They were never intended to be means of diagnosing pathology. So we shouldn't be using the theory to apportion blame, and we should be keeping love relationships and networks at the heart of practice. And quite a lot of our practice does the opposite of that. It doesn't accept that people may continue to love and care for parents who have done bad things to them, but are having difficult times and aren't parenting very well. And we just sever those. We sever them when we move children from one placement to another. It's a big part of social work practice, is severing the very thing that we're supposed to be supporting. So I think what we're arguing is that you know, use the theory, but use it in the context of a proper, empirical, compassionate engagement with the families that you're working with. What do you actually see? Stop categorising it and start describing it, because that's going to be much more powerful in producing ethical judgments. I think that's the end of that. So I don't know what to do now. Presumably Michaela's going to pop up somewhere.
I'm attempting to right now.
Right, okay. Anyway, I'm just going to turn the mic off.
Thank you so much, Sue, Matthew and Dave, for a fascinating critique of attachment theory. I'm going to switch the recording off now, as that is the end of the presentation.